All right, guys, welcome to week four. We're going to talk about boxing from 1960 to 1980. So, before we get started on this, we want to talk about this and the idea that there was a lot of social unrest, particularly in the 1960s, early 1970s. So, you had the Vietnam War raging during that time. Around 58,000 Americans lost their lives. Many more were missing. Um, and you also had the Civil Rights Movement, which was a struggle to end legal discrimination and racial segregation in America. So I want you to kind of have that in your mind as a backdrop as we start to talk about this. A lot of our focus this week is going to talk about Muhammad Ali. He's considered the last great heavyweight champion. He is also considered one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, and he held the title 3 different times. He was born Cassius Clay was his name, his birth name in Louisville, Kentucky in 1942. And he really came onto the stage as a light heavyweight gold medalist in the 1960 Rome Olympics. And through the middle 60s, he became really controversial for speaking out on issues. And he got his first chance to fight for the heavyweight championship in 1964 against Sonny Liston. And he was a huge underdog. You can see in this picture, Ali was not very big. Liston was an absolute brute of a man and had served time in prison for manslaughter. And most people didn't give him a chance to win the fight. And Ali KO'd or knocked out Liston in the 7th round to win the championship. Directly the day after the Liston fight, Ali comes out and announces that he's changed his name to Muhammad Ali, and that's what he wants to be called, that he had joined the Nation of Islam as a black Muslim. And you have to understand, guys, during this time, this was not popular with white or black Americans. Very few people knew much about this group, the Nation of Islam, and what they did know they didn't like. And it was really a group of troublemakers and outlaws. And so during this time, it was a very bumpy road for Ali. He really kind of developed a mean-spirited edge about him. He was very much a taunter. It was he pointed out a lot of the racism in America. And in 1967, he was stripped of his title for refusing his induction into the military to fight in Vietnam. Now, he could have took the military option. So what that meant is he could have done what Joe Louis and Jack Johnson did, where they were, they joined the military. They did, they went around the world and did exhibition fights, and that counted as their service, but he refused to. And so nobody in the world would sanction him to fight. And so he was court-martialed, and he didn't fight for over 3 years. And so the little bit of money he made of a living was speaking on college campus. And because he had lost his title, and it wasn't in a fight, they had to have another kind of tournament of champions, like we talked about earlier. And Joe Frazier won that tournament of champions to become a heavyweight title. So in 1971, Ali and Frazier fought for the first time in Madison Square Garden, and Frazier knocked him down in the 15th round to win a decision. And what I want to phrase this as, guys, I highly recommend you watch these fights. These two guys beat each other to death 3 different times, and they both paid for it later in their life. So Ali's kind of next big fight was the Rumble in the Jungle in 1974. And Ali defeated Joe Foreman in a huge upset. And Foreman was a huge heavyweight and very much favored in this fight. And Ali kind of selectively fought. He would land some really heavy blows to Foreman, and then he would lay on the ropes in what he called rope-a-dope and let Foreman just kind of punch himself out of steam. And he ended up knocking Foreman out in the 8th round. He would lose the title to Leon Spinks in 1978. He took him likely and lost a decision. And then 7 months later, he defeated Spinks and he retired. And he ended up having to come out of retirement because he lost all of his money. And he begged Larry Holmes, who was the champion at the time in 1980, to fight him. Holmes didn't want to fight him. He loved Ali. And Holmes ended up knocking Ali out. There's a really memorable part of that fight where you see Holmes crying because he had beaten Ali. So a really, really tragic downturn. And we'll talk about it more in the introduction video this week, guys. But I posted all of the big Ali fights, and I would highly recommend that you watch the fight with Frazier in Manila, the Thrilla in Manila. And I would recommend that you watch the Rumble in the Jungle. Those were classic fights. And so it was one of these deals where, very much like Jack Johnson, Ali in his prime was hated by white America. He was very brash. He was very braggadocious. He taunted his opponents inside, outside the ring. But he was a great fighter. So later in his life, he became loved by Americans later in his life. Boxing really took a toll on him. Particularly his fights with Frazier are probably some of the most brutal fights I've ever witnessed. And he suffered from Parkinson's later in his life, which caused him to not be able to speak much, which really took away, the one thing he was so well known for, that the taunting, the kind of personality he had. He was our Olympic torchlighter in the 1996 games. And I'll see if I can find a link, a video to that so you guys can see that. And he took back a lot of the kind of racist and hatred statements from his younger years. He took those things back and kind of reconciled his life. And I think that's why later in his life he was loved by so many Americans, because no matter what you thought about him during the time, no matter what you think about him at all, he was an unbelievable fighter. And he died in June of 2016. And so there's a great significance to Ali. He combined the social movements of the 1960s Vietnam protests and the civil rights movement. He was a hero to both movements. He would not go fight in Vietnam. Matter of fact, he made he came out, when he refused to take his induction into the Army, and said something to the effect of, I don't have no beef with those Viet Cong. He wanted nothing to do with it, and he stood on his principles. And a lot of people could argue he's the greatest heavyweight fighter in the history of the world. And unfortunately, guys, he paid for it physically in his fighting. There's no doubt his Parkinson's was probably caused by the significant amount of blows that he took to the head because of his style of boxing. There were some other great fighters of the era, and George Foreman was one of them. He fought in the same Olympic Games of the Mexico Olympic Games where we had the Americans protesters with the closed fist on the stands. And he came to the ring with a small American flag and showing kind of his support for America. And it really angered the black community at the time. They kind of saw him as a sellout. He was a great fighter. I don't think I think more people understand him or see him for the George Foreman grills that he made so much money off selling, and for commercials. The man was an unbelievable boxer. Obviously, we've talked about Joe Frazier, some other fighters that were prominent during that time: Larry Holmes, Sonny Liston, Leon Spinks. And so I encourage you guys to look at those other fighters. So I hope you enjoyed this, guys. I try to make these things less than 12 minutes if possible, but I provide you guys with a lot of videos that I hope you watch, because it's going to give you an opportunity to conduct more research and to learn more about what went on during this time. Thanks a lot. You guys are doing a fantastic job.